Heaven Lambert had been banned from the most sacred night of her life, and she had come anyway. The mating ritual was sacred, reserved only for the chosen, and she had been stripped of that right 3 weeks ago, her name removed from the registry by the very elders sworn to protect her. But Heaven Lambert had not been able to make herself leave. She stood outside the Moon Temple in the dark, hidden from no one, because there was nowhere left to hide. The stone courtyard was cold beneath her feet. The silver dress she had refused to trade for mourning clothes caught the moonlight and made her feel exposed in a way she could not name. Inside those doors, the most important night in the wolf world was unfolding without her. And then, something unexpected happened. As the Alpha King, the most powerful wolf across every territory, stopped walking. In the middle of the sacred hall, surrounded by hundreds of waiting wolves and pack elders and the weight of centuries of tradition, Eden Maxwell went completely still. He had caught a scent, not from inside the temple, from outside. His eyes found the open doors, and then he was moving, not slowly, not with ceremony, just moving, with the absolute certainty of something that has finally located what it has been looking for its entire life. When the great doors swung open and the moonlight poured in, and he stepped into the courtyard, every wolf inside went silent, because the Alpha King had just walked away from the ritual. For her, for the woman who had been banned from it. Heaven stood beneath the stone pillars and watched him come toward her, and felt something rise in her chest that was equal parts terror and recognition. Her wolf surging up to meet his like it had always known this moment was coming. One question burned through everything. Why is the Alpha King looking at me like I am the only thing in the world that matters? And the answer, when it came, would not just change her life. It would bring an entire kingdom to its knees. Chapter 1. The girl outside the ritual. The drums began at sundown. Heaven Lambert heard them from across the courtyard, deep and steady, rolling through the stone walls of the Moon Temple like a heartbeat that did not belong to her. She stood still beneath the ancient pillars carved with wolf crests and pack symbols, her hands folded in front of her, while her chin lifted, even though everything inside her wanted to lower it. The night air was cool against her skin. Jasmine and burning cedar drifted from the temple doors every time they swung open, carrying the warmth of a ceremony she had no right to witness. Inside those doors, hundreds of wolves from every territory gathered beneath silver lanterns. They wore white. They carried flowers chosen by their pack elders. They laughed softly with family members who had dressed them with careful, trembling hands that morning, whispering prayers and promises into their hair. Tonight was the mating ritual, the most sacred night in the wolf world. The night fate revealed its choices, and Heaven Lambert was not allowed inside. She pressed her back against one of the stone pillars and breathed slowly. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way she had learned to breathe when the world tried to make her feel small. Her silver dress caught the moonlight and turned it to something almost beautiful, which felt like a cruel joke. She had worn it anyway, not to impress anyone, not out of hope. She had worn it because she refused to stand outside this temple in mourning clothes. She refused to dress herself like someone who had already given up. She had not given up, but she was not inside either. 3 weeks ago, the world had shifted. 3 weeks ago, Heaven Lambert had looked Gerald Bullock in the eye and said no. It had happened at the mid-season gathering, the last formal assembly before the ritual. Pack elders from every territory filled the hall of Cantrell Lodge. The scent of roasted meat and old wood and territorial pride had hung heavy in the air. and Gerald Bullock had stood before her like a man who had never once been told he could not have something. He was handsome, everyone agreed on that. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a jaw carved sharp and eyes the color of dark amber. He dressed well. He spoke smoothly. He carried his wealth the way powerful men always do. Not by showing it, but by moving as though everything in the room already belonged to him. He had looked at heaven the way a man looks at something he has decided to own. "You'll enter the ritual under my name," he said. Not a question, barely even a sentence, just a statement of a future he had already arranged in his own mind. Heaven had stood very still. She thought about what she knew. She thought about the names she had found in old ledgers while helping Elder Hampton's assistant reorganize the pack archive records. There were 3 names, women who had been formally bonded to Gerald Bullock in ceremonies smaller than the ritual, quieter in the years before his rise to influence. Women who were no longer spoken of: Myla Hampton, Nicole Williamson, Stephania McCarthy. She had asked questions, careful, quiet questions, and the answers she received were always the same. They moved away. They found other packs. They wanted a fresh start. But there were no forwarding records, no address transfers, no letters, no one who had actually seen them leave. Women didn't simply vanish from pack records without a trace, not unless someone made them vanish. Heaven had thought about all of this in the space of 2 seconds, while Gerald Bullock waited for her agreement. Then she said, "No." The room went quiet. Gerald's expression did not change immediately. It shifted slowly, or the way ice cracks, first a hairline fracture, then something deeper. "I'm sorry. I said no, Gerald." Her voice was steady. "I won't enter the ritual under your name." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. By morning, Elder Edward Hampton had summoned her. He sat behind his heavy oak desk with his hands folded, and his eyes carrying the careful blankness of a man who had already made a decision and was only now delivering it. "You embarrass this pack," he said. Heaven stood straight. "I refused a man I don't trust. That is my right under ritual law." Morris Chandler, who stood beside the door with his arms crossed, made a sound low in his throat. "Gerald Bullock has alliances with 4 territories. His support keeps the Cantrell pack at the table during council sessions. What you did last night has consequences for every wolf in this territory, not just yourself." "And the women who disappeared after bonding with him?" Heaven asked. "Do they have consequences too?" The silence that followed was different from the first one. Heavier, more deliberate. Elder Hampton set his pen down on his desk. "There are no women. Those are old rumors. Gossip. I found their names in the archive records. You were assisting with organization, not investigation." His voice dropped, and for just a moment, something moved behind his eyes that looked almost like fear. "This conversation is over, Heaven. Your name has been removed from the ritual registry. You will not attend the ceremony." She stared at him. "You are banned from the mating ritual." 3 weeks later, Morshi stood outside the temple and listened to the drums and breathed jasmine smoke and did not let herself cry. She was 23 years old. In wolf culture, missing the mating ritual was not a minor inconvenience. The ritual was the primary gathering point, ordained by pack tradition. The ceremony where fated mates most often found each other, drawn together by the sacred space, the concentrated energy, the moon. Wolves who missed their window sometimes found mates through other means. But the older wolves whispered that those bonds were never as strong, never as clean, never as certain. Heaven told herself she didn't believe that. She was mostly convincing. The temple doors opened again. Warm light spilled across the courtyard stones. Two young wolves stepped out, laughing softly together, but already drawn close by whatever force pulled at them inside. Heaven looked away. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the temple's ancient stone walls, the moon hung full and heavy in the sky, silver and absolute, watching everything without judgment. Heaven tilted her face up toward it. She did not know, could not have known, that somewhere inside the moon temple, in the moment she lifted her face to the moonlight, a man had just gone completely still. Alpha King Eden Maxwell had not wanted to attend the ritual. That was not something he could say out loud, of course. He was the Alpha King. The mating ritual was held under his authority. His presence was not optional. It was the seal that made the ceremony official. Without the Alpha King standing witness, no bonds formed that night would be recognized across all territories. So he had come. He had dressed in black, which was his preference for everything. He had entered the Moon Temple with his council members flanking him on both sides. He had watched the silver lanterns sway and the ceremonial fire burn at the center of the hall. He had stood at the head of the gathering and let the ceremony begin. He was 27 years old and had attended 6 mating rituals in his capacity as king. He had watched other wolves find their mates in this hall with expressions of complete, stunned wonder, pulled together by something invisible and overwhelming. He had never felt it himself. Part of him had quietly begun to wonder if he ever would. A part of him had more quietly begun to wonder if that was simply the cost of his position. If the weight of the crown and the constant performance of authority had somehow put something essential behind a wall he could no longer locate. He did not speak of this to anyone. Not to Josiah, his most trusted person. Not to Lydia, who ran his household with more acuity than most of his council members and noticed everything. Not even to himself, really, except in the very late hours of nights when the castle was quiet and he sat at the library window and looked out at the northern forest and acknowledged that there was a particular kind of loneliness that had nothing to do with being alone. He stood now at the edge of the ceremonial floor, watching the assembled wolves move through the opening procession, when it hit him. Not gradually, or not with warning, like a door blown off its frame, a scent. He had read descriptions of this moment in the old texts, the ones kept in the library of his family's castle, written by alphas centuries dead, who had tried to put language to something that resisted language entirely. They used words like electric and overwhelming and undeniable. One of them had written simply, "You will know." Eden had always thought those descriptions were theatrical, romantic exaggeration, embellishment born from the desire to make an animal instinct sound poetic. He understood now that they had been understating it. The scent was, he had no words, warm, like sunlight on stone, like rain on forest earth, like something he had never smelled before, and somehow recognized immediately as the thing he had been breathing toward his entire life without knowing it. His wolf surged inside his chest with an urgency that was almost violent. He turned his head. The scent was not coming from inside the temple. It was coming from outside. Josiah, his head of personal security, stepped close to his shoulder. "My king? Open the doors." Josiah paused. "The ceremony is mid-procession. The elders will open them." The doors opened. Moonlight came in like water. And there she was. Heaven had been looking up at the moon. When the temple doors opened, she lowered her face, startled by the flood of light and warmth from inside. She squinted into the brightness, expecting to see another couple slipping out, another laughing pair who had found each other already. Instead, she saw a man standing in the doorway, tall, dark-clothed. Still the way only very powerful things are still, not with effort, but with the absolute confidence of something that has never had a reason to move unless it chose to. His eyes found her immediately. And something happened. She felt it in her chest first. A pressure, sudden and warm, like a hand pressed flat against her sternum from the inside. Her wolf, the animal self she had lived with her whole life and knew the way you know a sibling, rose up inside her with a sound she had never heard it make before. Not a warning, not aggression, recognition. The man in the doorway stepped down from the temple threshold and walked toward her. Behind him, she could see the entire assembly of the mating ritual frozen in place. Hundreds of wolves staring through the open doors at the Alpha King walking away from the ceremony. Heaven didn't move. She could not. Her feet had decided, apparently, and that the ground directly beneath her was the most important place in the world. He stopped in front of her. Up close, he was even more. She did not have a word for it. His eyes were dark, the color of deep forest shadow, and they were looking at her with an expression she had never seen on anyone's face before. Like recognition, like relief, like something that had been searching for a very long time and had just, finally, arrived. "You're the one they banned from the ritual," he said. His voice was low, quiet, not unkind. Heaven lifted her chin. Yes. Something moved across his face. She could not name it, but she felt the answer it sent through her, warm and strange and terrifying, because he was looking at her like she was the most significant thing he had ever seen in his life, and she was outside the temple, and he had just walked out of the most sacred ceremony in the wolf world to stand in front of her. "I'm Eden," he said. She already knew. Every wolf in every territory knew the Alpha King's name and face. But something about the way he said it, not Alpha King Maxwell, not a title, not an announcement, just Eden, made her breath catch in a way she could not explain. "Heaven," she said. "Heaven Lambert." He breathed in slowly, and the look on his face when he exhaled told her that her scent was doing to him exactly what his was doing to her. "Come inside," he said quietly. She stared at him. "I've been banned." "Not anymore." His voice carried absolute certainty. "Not by me." Chapter 2. The King Who Stopped the Ceremony. Heaven stepped through the doors of the Moon Temple for the first time. She had imagined this moment her whole life, and found, now that it was happening, that she had imagined it completely wrong. She had imagined walking in with the other unmarked wolves, nervous and hopeful, clutching her ceremonial flowers. She had imagined the silver lantern light falling across her face. She had imagined standing in the sacred circle and feeling the pull of fate begin to move. She had not imagined walking in beside the Alpha King, while every single person in the hall turned to stare at them. The silence was immense. She kept her eyes forward. She kept her shoulders straight. She pressed her wolf down gently. It wanted to surge toward Eden with every step, strained at the invisible leash of her self-control like something half wild and completely certain. Eden walked beside her without hurry, but his presence was a physical thing, warm and unmistakable, like standing near a controlled fire. He did not touch her, but he was close enough that the hem of his sleeve nearly brushed her arm as they walked, and each time it almost did, she felt the almost contact like a spark. The pack elders stood in a tight cluster near the sacred flame. Elder Hampton was among them. When his eyes found Heaven, his face went through several expressions very quickly. Shock, anger, calculation, and then a careful blankness that she recognized as the face he wore when he was deciding what to say. Morris Chandler had no such careful blankness. He stepped forward immediately, his voice dropping into a register that was meant to convey authority without making a scene. "My king, the ceremony cannot be interrupted. The procession is suspended," Eden said, or not harshly, simply, the way you state a fact. "I'll explain in a moment." Morris looked at Heaven with an expression she had seen before, the one powerful men wore when they encountered something they had dismissed and suddenly needed to reassess. Gerald Bullock was standing near the far wall with a group of territorial alphas, and when he saw Heaven enter beside the Alpha King, his face did something strange. The easy, practiced charm collapsed inward. Just for a second. Just enough for her to see what lived underneath it. Then he smoothed his expression and began to walk towards them. This woman was removed from the ritual registry by pack elders acting on a complaint from Gerald Bullock, Eden said. He was addressing the assembled hall, but his voice was measured, not a proclamation, a statement. "I'd like to understand the full nature of that complaint before this ceremony continues." Elder Hampton stepped forward. "My king, with respect, the Cantrell Pack's internal disciplinary decisions are subject to review when they affect ritual access." Eden's tone did not change. That has always been the law. Gerald moved through the crowd smoothly, stopping a respectful distance away. His eyes were steady, controlled. But Heaven noticed the slight tension in his jaw, the way his hands were very carefully still at his sides. "Alpha King." Gerald inclined his head. Heaven Lambert refused a formal courtship agreement she had verbally accepted. The ban was a consequence of that breach. Heaven felt the words land like a hand against her chest. She had accepted nothing. She had said she would consider it, and consideration was not acceptance, and the difference mattered. But more than that, something else rose in her chest, hot and clear. Not just anger, clarity. The kind that comes when you have been holding something quietly for weeks, and suddenly the moment opens up and asks you to speak. "I refused him," she said. Her voice carried through the hall cleanly. "I didn't breach an agreement. I made a decision." Gerald's eyes moved to her with slow, deliberate patience. "She was given an offer, and I said I would think about it. Not yes." She turned her attention to Elder Hampton. "I need to know why 3 women who were formally bonded to Gerald Bullock in private ceremonies have no traceable records after their bonding dates. No pack transfers, no letters, no witnesses who saw them leave." The hall was very quiet. Myla Hampton. She spoke each name with care. Nicole Williamson, Stefania McCarthy. Gerald smiled. It was a beautiful smile. That was the worst part. Those women chose to start over elsewhere. It's not unusual for... I found the archive records. She kept her voice steady. She had prepared for this. She had thought about the possibility that she would say this in public ever since the night she read those ledgers. Bonding certificates filed. Pack registration updates filed. No exit paperwork. No destination records. No contact requests from receiving packs. They didn't transfer. They disappeared. The silence in the hall had changed. It was no longer the silence of an interrupted ceremony. It was heavier. It carried weight. Elder Hampton's face had gone pale. Gerald was still smiling, but the smile had thinned. Eden stood beside her and said nothing, but she felt him listening with his whole body, still and focused in the way of someone who has just filed a piece of information somewhere important and intends to act on it. "These are serious accusations," Eden said at last, and now there was something quiet and final in his tone. "They'll be investigated by the Alpha Council, formally." He looked at Gerald with dark, steady eyes. Until that investigation concludes, you'll refrain from participating in tonight's ceremony." Gerald's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes went cold. He inclined his head with perfect politeness. "Of course, Alpha King." The ceremony resumed. Heaven stood inside the Moon Temple for the first time, surrounded by silver lanterns and the low pulse of ceremonial drums and the soft, the watchful presence of hundreds of wolves waiting for fate to move. Eden stood beside her. He was not touching her. He was not pressing the bond. He was simply there, a warm, solid presence at her shoulder, and every breath she took was filled with the scent of him. Cedar and cold water, and something underneath those things that had no name. Something that spoke directly to the animal part of her in a language older than words. Her wolf was singing. She did not know how else to describe it. A low, sustained sound, not quite joy, not quite urgency. Something in between, something that knew. She caught Elder Hampton watching her from across the hall with an expression she could not fully read. Wariness, certainly. And underneath it, something that might have been relief. Or maybe regret. She looked away from him. Later, when the ceremony had settled into its quieter rhythms, when other wolves had begun to move together in the way of people pulled by the invisible thread of recognition, Eden leaned slightly toward her. "Are you all right?" She considered the question honestly. "I don't know yet." "That's a good answer," he said quietly. "Better than yes." She looked at him sidelong. In the lantern light, the sharp lines of his face softened slightly. He was watching the ceremony with the careful attention of someone who was thinking about many things at once. "Why did you come outside?" she asked. He turned to look at her, and she felt the full weight of his attention, like sunlight, direct and warm and impossible to look at directly. "Because you were there," he said simply. She held his gaze. "But you left the ritual for a scent." "Yes. That's very reckless for a king." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was something. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe it's the most necessary thing I've ever done." She did not have an answer for that. She filed it away instead, in the part of her mind that was keeping careful track of every moment of this impossible night. Later, when the ceremony ended and the temple slowly emptied, Eden found her standing in the temple garden where the jasmine grew thick against the stone walls. The moon was high by then, pouring silver over everything. He stopped beside her, and they stood in silence for a moment, which felt strange because the air between them was not silent at all. It hummed with the bond that had not yet been completed, not a living current that she could feel along her skin whenever he was close. "I want to ask you something," he said. She turned to look at him. "Come to the castle, as a guest, not a prisoner, not a subject, a guest." He paused. "I want time to know you before either of us decides anything." She studied his face. The moon drew his features in silver and shadow. He looked like something from an old story. But his eyes were just eyes, steady and honest, and a little uncertain in a way that surprised her. "For how long?" she asked. "1 month." She was quiet for a long moment. "And at the end of the month, you decide," he said, "whether to complete the bond or walk away from it. Entirely your choice. No pressure from me. No pack politics. No elder alliances." He met her gaze. "Just your choice." No wolf had ever offered her that. Not even close. She breathed in slowly. His scent wrapped around her like warm arms, and her wolf went still and certain in her chest, the way it went still when it was very sure about something. "All right," she said. 1 month. Chapter 3. the castle on the high ridge. Eden Maxwell's castle sat on the high ridge above the northern forest, where the tree line broke and the land opened into a wide plateau of stone and sky. From certain windows on the upper floors, you could see 3 territories at once on a clear day. The ridge road that led up to it wound through old-growth pine and silver birch, and Heaven watched the trees close around the car and then open again as the road climbed until the castle appeared at the crest. Dark stone against a pale morning sky. Towers at each corner, and ivy covering the eastern face so thickly that it moved in the breeze like something alive. She had told herself to be practical. She had told herself this was a month of consideration, not a fairy tale, and she would approach it the way she approached everything difficult, methodically, eyes open, no wishful thinking allowed. She pressed her lips together and looked at her hands in her lap. Heaven arrived the morning after the ritual in a car sent by Eden's staff. She had one bag. She had left Elder Hampton's territory without saying goodbye to anyone except her younger cousin Winnie, who had pressed both hands around hers at the door and said, "You always deserved more than they gave you. Go get it." Winnie had been crying when she said it. Heaven had not been, because she had cried quietly the night before, when no one was watching, and she was done with it now. She was not someone who cried twice over the same thing. The car climbed the ridge, and she watched the view expand below. The forest, the distant silver thread of the river that divided the Cantrell territory from the open territories beyond. And beyond that, the wide horizon. She had lived her whole life in that land, and had not known until this morning how small it had made her feel. She turned her face away from the window. The castle was not what she had expected. She had expected grandeur that announced itself. Towering ceilings, formal portraits, the cold perfection of a place designed to impress rather than comfort. And there was some of that. The architecture was old and beautiful, carved stone and wide corridors and staircases that curved like something from a dream. But there were also books stacked on windowsills, dogs sleeping in patches of morning sun, kitchen staff who laughed loudly enough that the sound echoed down the main hall, a garden visible through every south-facing window, overgrown in the particular way of gardens that are loved but not controlled. She passed a room on the way to the east staircase, where someone had left a half-eaten piece of toast on a stack of territorial maps, which felt profoundly human and made her breathe a little easier. A woman named Lydia Phillips met her at the entrance. She was the castle's head of household staff, brisk and warm in equal measure, with close-cropped natural hair and eyes that assessed Heaven with complete directness in the space of about 2 seconds. "Good," Lydia said, apparently satisfied by whatever she had assessed. "You look like someone who can hold her own. The king's been pacing since sunrise." Heaven looked up. Pacing? Lydia's expression was carefully neutral. "He does that when something matters to him." She turned and walked. "Come, I'll show you your rooms." The rooms were beautiful. High-ceilinged, south-facing, with windows that looked out over the garden, a bed with heavy curtains, a writing desk, shelves already stocked with books, and not randomly either. She found titles she recognized, authors she loved, subjects that had interested her for years. Someone had done research. She stood in the middle of the room for a long moment, holding the thought of that. Someone had taken time to learn what she read. She set her bag down and went to the window. But the garden below was full of late-blooming roses and old stone paths, and a fountain that had clearly been repaired recently. The mortar around its base was fresh. The morning light turned everything amber and soft. The roses were planted by my grandmother. She turned Eden stood in the doorway. He had knocked. She had not heard it over her own thoughts. He was in a dark grey shirt, no jacket, which was the first time she had seen him without the formal layers of the night before. He looked younger this way, not less powerful. He was still the most physically present person she had ever been in a room with, but less constructed. More himself. "They're beautiful," she said. "She would have liked you." He leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. She was stubborn about what was right, too. Heaven almost smiled. "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation. The compliment is separate." He paused. "You look well rested, which you probably aren't." "I'm not," she admitted. "I barely slept." "Neither did I." He said it without self-consciousness, the way you tell someone a simple fact. "Breakfast is in the East Room when you're ready. No one will come to find you. No schedule, no obligations." He straightened from the doorway. "You're a guest, Heaven. Not a prisoner, not a project." She looked at him. "I mean that," he said quietly. "I know," she said. And she was surprised to discover that she did. The days settled into rhythms she hadn't planned. Morning. She read in the garden while the light was still cool, her tea growing cold at her elbow while she finished whatever she had started the night before. Sometimes Eden was there too, was working through correspondence at the stone table near the fountain, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they did not, and both felt equally natural. Afternoon, the castle had a library that took up the entirety of the castle's west wing, 3 floors of it. Dark wood shelves and rolling ladders and reading alcoves built into the walls like small caves. She lost hours there every day. On the 3rd afternoon, she turned a corner and found Eden already in one of the alcoves, reading with his feet propped on the opposite bench and his jacket abandoned over the back of his chair. He looked up. His expression did something complicated. "I should have mentioned the library," he said. "You should have," she agreed. She looked at the title of the book in his hands. "That one's good in the 3rd act, or the first half is slow." He looked down at the book. "I'm in the first half. Push through." He held her gaze for a second. Then he went back to reading. She found the alcove at the far end of the row and settled in with her own book, and for the next 2 hours they sat in companionable silence in the castle library, while late afternoon light moved slowly across the wooden floor. She thought later that it might have been the most comfortable she had felt with another person in years. Evening was when things became more difficult. Not in a bad way, in a way that required very careful management of herself. The bond between them was a living thing. It did not sleep, did not rest, did not politely wait for her to finish processing the fact of its existence. Every time Eden was near her, at dinner, in the garden, and passing in the corridor, it pulled, warm and certain and completely unreasonable. One week in, they walked the northern garden path at dusk, side by side, close enough that their arms nearly touched. The sky above the ridge had gone deep gold and rose. Below the high plateau, the forest was a dark, breathing mass. What was it like, she asked, growing up as the Alpha King's heir? He was quiet for a moment, and she had already learned that his silences meant he was considering how honest to be. "Lonely," he said finally. In the specific way of someone who is always surrounded by people who want something from them. She understood that more than she expected. Everyone in my pack wanted me to be what made their alliances work, not a person, a piece. Yes, he glanced at her. Exactly that. They walked a few more steps. "Did you ever think about leaving?" she asked. "Every day until I was about 19. A slight pause. "Then I decided it was easier to change the thing you're part of than to abandon it." She thought about Elder Hampton, about Morris Chandler, about the political calculation in their eyes when they spoke to her. "I'm not sure I agree," she said. "You don't have to." There was no defensiveness in it. "What do you think?" She looked out over the forest. The first stars were appearing above the tree line. "I think sometimes a place isn't broken," she said. "Sometimes it's just wrong for you. And the healthy thing is knowing the difference." He stopped walking. She stopped too and turned to look at him. He was watching her with an expression that had weight to it, something careful and searching. "What is the Cantrell territory wrong for you?" he asked quietly. She held his gaze. "It was. I think I knew that before Gerald." "And now?" She looked at him for a long moment. The bond moved between them like a tide. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "That's what this month is for." He nodded slowly. Then he started walking again, and she fell into step beside him. And neither of them spoke for a while, and it was not uncomfortable. But her hand, she noticed, had moved closer to his as they walked, and he had not moved away. Chapter 4. The Month of Temptation. 2 weeks into the month, it rained for 3 days. The castle turned inward. Fires burned in every hearth. The dogs moved from sunlit floor patches to fireside cushions. The smell of rain came in through every crack in the stone, damp and green. And the garden outside Heaven's window turned silver and soft. She and Eden spent the 3 rain days almost entirely in the library. They had discovered, somewhere in the 2nd week, that they disagreed about almost everything except the things that mattered most. He believed pack law needed to be enforced from the top down, consistently, without exceptions. She believed that laws written without input from the people they governed would always crack at the seams. He thought sentimentality was a liability in leadership. She thought it was the only thing that made leadership worth following. They argued about all of it, thoroughly, without either of them becoming angry, which surprised her more than anything else about him. "You're not going to just agree with me to make the conversation easier," she observed on the 2nd rain day. No, he looked up from his book. "No." "Good," she said. He almost smiled. She was beginning to catalogue his almost smiles, the various small shifts in the architecture of his face that constituted his versions of what other people expressed with full expressions. She had started to find them more satisfying than the complete version would have been. On the 3rd rain day, she was curled in the library alcove with a blanket and a book she was not actually reading when he came and stood in the entrance to the alcove. She looked up. He looked back. The firelight from the wall sconce behind him lit the edges of his jaw and shoulders. The rain hissed softly against the tall library windows. They were the only 2 people in the West Wing at that hour. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to tell me honestly if it's uncomfortable." She lowered her book. "All right. Do you feel the bond getting stronger?" She held his gaze. "Yes." He breathed. "I'm not asking because I want to push it. I'm asking because I want to know if it's affecting your ability to make a real choice." She thought about it, genuinely. "It's not pushing me toward anything I don't already want," she said carefully. "I think it's amplifying, not manufacturing." "There's a difference," he agreed. "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "Do you feel it pulling you?" "Every hour," he said, with the quiet directness she had come to associate with the moments when he stopped being careful and just told her the truth. "But I won't act on it until you decide." She held his gaze. The rain ran down the windows. "Oh, that's very disciplined of you," she said. "It is," he agreed flatly. She laughed. It surprised them both. It was the first real laugh she had given in weeks, unguarded and full, and she watched his face change when he heard it. Something soft and startled moving through his eyes before he controlled it. She tucked the laugh away in her memory. She tucked the look in his eyes away with it. In the third week, they stopped keeping polite distance. It was not a decision either of them made. It was just what happened. Their walks in the garden became longer, their evenings in the library later. She began to leave her shoes by the garden door, where his boots were always lined up. He began to leave a second cup beside the tea service in the mornings without being asked. There was one morning when she came down early, before the rest of the castle woke, and found him already at the garden table with a pot of tea and 2 cups, and his eyes already lifted toward the garden path before she even opened the door, as though he had heard her coming. Not with effort, not deliberately, just the instinct of a wolf whose entire awareness was tuned to one direction. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at him, looking at her. He did not say anything. He lifted the second cup toward her. She sat down across from him and wrapped her hands around the cup and breathed the steam, and they were quiet together in the early morning light for a long time. It was Lydia who finally said something. On the 15th day, she found Heaven arranging a vase of late garden roses in the main corridor, and paused with the directness she applied to everything. "He hasn't sat at the head of the dinner table since you arrived," Lydia said. "He sits in the middle now, closer to your seat." Heaven looked at the roses. "He doesn't know he's doing it," Lydia added, with the smallest possible edge of something warm in her voice. "In case that matters to you." Heaven set a rose in the vase with careful attention. "It might," she said. Lydia made a sound that was not quite a smile and walked away. One evening after dinner, they sat on the stone terrace above the garden with 2 glasses of wine and the view of 3 territories fading into the dark. The stars above the ridge were sharp and dense, the way they only got when you were away from city light. She was telling him about growing up in the Cantrell territory, the good parts, but the things she would miss. When she glanced over and found him watching her instead of the view, she stopped mid-sentence. "Sorry," he said, and he did not look away. "Keep going." She felt warmth climb her throat. "You weren't listening." "I was listening," he said. "I was also looking." She turned her face back toward the view, but her heart had done something irregular. "Eden." "Yes." "You're making this very difficult." A pause. "I know." His voice dropped, quiet and rough at the edges, in a way that went directly through her. "I'm trying not to." She set her wine glass down on the terrace stone. Then she turned and looked at him fully, and he looked back at her, and the bond between them was a living, breathing, urgent thing in the dark, pulling like a current, like a tide, like something that had been patient long enough. She reached out and touched the back of his hand where it rested on the stone. His breath changed, just slightly, but she felt it. His hand turned over under hers, slowly, and his fingers curled around hers with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood the weight of what they were doing. They sat like that, her hand in his, the dark and the stars above them, the bond humming between their joined fingers. For a long time. Neither of them spoke, but in the silence, Heaven felt something settle inside her that had been restless for years. On the 20th night, it happened. They had been in the library late. Past midnight, the castle quiet, the fire burning low in the grate. They had been arguing about territory law, something about the right of an Omega to refuse council-arranged bonding agreements. Adam believed the law was already clear. Heaven believed the law was written clearly and applied inconsistently. which was an entirely different thing, and she had said so with considerable directness. He had argued back, properly, with evidence. She had appreciated that more than she should have, and then at some point they had both gone quiet, and the argument had settled, and the fire crackled, and neither of them moved toward the door. She looked at the fire. She could feel him looking at her. It had been building for days, the careful maintenance of appropriate distance, the not quite accidental brushing of hands when they reached for the same thing, the way he leaned slightly toward her whenever she spoke and seemed to catch himself and pull back. The restraint between them had become its own kind of presence in every room, was as warm and undeniable as the bond itself. She turned her head. He was already looking at her. Not carefully, not with the managed expression she had come to associate with the times he was being deliberately measured. Just looking at her with the full, undefended weight of everything he felt, and she felt the directness of it in her chest, like a hand pressed against her heart. Eden crossed the distance between them. He touched her face first, one hand against her cheek, slow and deliberate, and the contact sent heat running through her entire body in a wave that had nothing to do with the fire behind them. His thumb traced the edge of her jaw, and she felt her breath go unsteady. Heaven. His voice was very low. I know, she said. He kissed her, slowly, deeply, with the full weight of 3 weeks of carefully maintained restraint behind it, which meant it was nothing like a first kiss should logically feel. It felt like a recognition, like something finally released, like breathing after being underwater too long. She gripped the front of his shirt and kissed him back without reservation, and she felt him exhale against her mouth with a sound that was low and relieved, like a man who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time. The bond between them surged, not violently, not the completion surge that she had read about and half feared, but a deep, rolling warmth that spread through her chest and her hands and the back of her neck, her wolf rising to meet his with a sound that was unmistakably joy. She was dimly aware that they were both trembling slightly, or she did not care at all. When they finally broke apart, his forehead came to rest against hers. His hands were warm at her waist. She was still holding the front of his shirt. Neither of them moved. They stood there, breathing the same air, the fire low and the castle quiet, and the night pressing softly against the library windows. Still not completing the bond, he said. His voice had gone rough in a way that made the words sound like an honest effort. She almost laughed. I know. You have 10 days left. I know, Eden. His hands tightened slightly at her waist, then relaxed. I'm not going anywhere, she said softly. Not a decision, just a truth she wanted him to have. Something eased in his face. He pulled her slightly closer, and she let him rest his cheek against her temple, and they stood in the firelight of the castle library while the night moved past them, and nothing was complete yet. But everything felt changed. Later, she lay awake in her high-ceilinged room and looked at the ceiling and listened to the castle breathing around her and thought about a wolf who had left the ritual hall for a scent. She thought about a man who had offered her a choice when no one ever had. She thought about 10 days, which was 9 more than she needed. Chapter 5. The Truth About Gerald Bullock. The news arrived on the 22nd day. Heaven was in the garden when Josiah came to find her. His expression, carrying that particular controlled tension she had learned, meant something significant was happening inside the castle's operational world. News from the Eastern Territory border, he said. The Alpha Council's investigators found something. He brought her to the council chamber, where Eden was already standing at the long table with 2 investigators and a council elder named Jeremy Williamson, whose family name made Heaven's breath catch when she remembered Nicole Williamson's name in the archive records. Jeremy's face was rigid with the effort of composure. On the table was a series of documents and photographs that the investigators spread carefully as they spoke. A woman had been found near the eastern forest border. She had been discovered by a patrol team, hidden in a shelter that was not on any official map. A structure built into the base of an old stone outcropping, accessed through a tunnel entrance concealed by undergrowth. She had been there for a long time, long enough that the investigators' voices had gone quiet and careful when they described the conditions. She was alive. Her name was Mila Hampton, Elder Edward Hampton's niece, Gerald Bullock's first official mate. Heaven's hands had gone cold. Mila Hampton was alive, and she had been in that shelter for 3 years, and the moment she understood she was safe, she had begun to talk. The Alpha Council convened a full formal hearing within 48 hours. Mila was brought to the castle for the proceedings, quiet and pale, with the careful stillness of someone who has learned that stillness is safer than movement. But her voice, when she gave her testimony, was clear. She had clearly been preparing what she was going to say for a very long time. Heaven sat beside Eden during the testimony. She had not been required to attend. The council had not asked her to. But Eden had asked quietly if she wanted to be present, and she had said yes without hesitation. She needed to hear it. Mila described the first months of her bonding with Gerald with a flat precision that was more harrowing than any amount of emotion would have been. The control, the isolation, the way he had cut her off from her family, one small policy at a time, always with a reasonable explanation, always with a smile. And then, when she became pregnant with his child, and something in her changed, when she started asking questions, the kind Gerald did not like, he had imprisoned her. He told me I had been transferred to a recovery facility in the east, Mila said. He sent my family notices with my signature forged on them. He told them I was healing from a difficult birth. She paused. The child died. He told me it was my fault. The council chamber was silent. Heaven felt Eden's hand settle on hers under the table, very gently. She turned her palm up and held on. Nicole Williamson was already there when I arrived, Mila continued. She had been there 18 months. Stefania McCarthy arrived 6 months after me. She looked at Jeremy Williamson directly. Nicole spoke about you often. She wanted you to know she never stopped loving you. Jeremy Williamson's composure broke. Just for a moment. Then he put it back together with visible effort and wrote something on the paper in front of him, which was clearly not council notes. Gerald Bullock was arrested by the Alpha Council's enforcement officers at the Cantrell Lodge that same afternoon. Heaven was in the garden when she heard that news. She was standing by the roses Eden's grandmother had planted, which were past their full bloom now, but still fragrant in the afternoon heat. She stood very still for a long time after Josiah told her. She had known. She had seen the records and known there was something wrong, and she had been banned from the ritual and called a disgrace and told to be quiet and not make trouble. She had made trouble anyway. And because she had made trouble, Mila Hampton was out of that shelter. Nicole Williamson's family knew the truth. Stefania McCarthy, found a day after Mila, was being reunited with her own family as Heaven stood here in the garden. She breathed the rose-scented air and didn't cry, exactly. But something tight that had lived in her chest for 3 years loosened. Eden found her there. He stood beside her without speaking for a moment, and she was grateful for that, for the way he had learned over 3 weeks that sometimes she needed quiet instead of words. "Myla asked about you," he said finally. Heaven looked up. "About me?" "She said she heard your name from one of the elders who came to the shelter. Apparently Hampton knew you had found records. He went to Gerald." Eden's jaw was steady, but his eyes were not. "She wanted me to tell you that what you did mattered." Heaven pressed her lips together. "She said you saved her life, that the questions you asked, the ones that got you banned, were the first crack in the wall that Gerald had built around everything he did." She looked down at the roses. "I didn't feel brave," she said quietly. "I was terrified, and I couldn't pretend not to know what I knew." "That's what brave actually is," Eden said. He was looking at her with that steady, careful attention. Not the absence of fear, just the inability to pretend. She looked up at him. He was standing close. Not as close as he had been in the library, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the quiet gravity that she had stopped resisting weeks ago, and simply allowed herself to experience. She reached up and touched the side of his face. He went very still. "Thank you," she said, "for listening to me that night at the temple, for not making me invisible." His hand came up to cover hers where it rested on his jaw. His eyes were dark and steady, and so honestly tender that it almost undid her. "I couldn't have," he said quietly, "not even if I'd tried." Elder Edward Hampton was summoned before the Alpha Council the following week. He arrived looking diminished in a way that had nothing to do with physical size. He had always been a large man, broad-shouldered and authoritative. Now he looked like a man carrying weight he had not expected to be held accountable for. The charges were not imprisonment. Hampton had not known the full extent of what Gerald had done to Myla. But he had known enough. He had known that Heaven's questions were dangerous to Gerald. He had known that banning her from the ritual served Gerald's interests. He had made that choice with full awareness of what it cost Heaven, and he had made it for political survival. He was stripped of his elder status. Morris Chandler was placed on formal review. Of the Cantrell pack would have new leadership by spring. Heaven learned all of this through Eden, who told her plainly and without editorializing, letting her process the information at her own pace. She was quiet for a long time after the last update. Then she said, "He was afraid of Gerald. I think he had been for years." Eden looked at her. "That doesn't make it right," she added. "What he did to me, to others." She thought of Myla. "But I think fear made him smaller than he wanted to be." She looked out the window. "I almost feel sorry for him." "Almost," Eden noted. "Almost," she agreed. Chapter 6. The night the bond almost broke. There were 8 days left in the month when the doubt came. It arrived the way doubts always do, quietly, through a side entrance, while Heaven was not looking for it. She had been reading in the garden at dusk when Poppy, one of the younger castle staff who had become a kind of casual friend, sat down across from her with an expression that carried news. "There are things being said," Poppy said carefully, "in the lower territories, about you and the king." Heaven set her book down. The things being said were, apparently, numerous and varied. Some said Heaven had manipulated the ritual, using wolf magic she had no right to. Some said she had thrown herself at the Alpha King to escape pack punishment. Some said she was a criminal who had fabricated evidence against Gerald Bullock. Some said the Alpha King had been compromised by a scent bond and was no longer capable of ruling objectively. Poppy's voice was careful and apologetic as she relayed each of these. "I thought you should know, and before you decide anything. It seems fair that you know what you'd be walking into. Heaven sat with it. The doubt that had arrived was not about Eden. It was about herself, about whether the love she felt, and she was clear enough in her own heart now to call it love, she had been for days, was something that was fair to him, whether attaching herself to him would compromise everything he had built, whether her story, messy and public and politically complicated, was too much weight to bring to the throne. She thought about this, alone for an afternoon. Then, because she was someone who had never been able to pretend she did not know what she knew, she went to find him. He was in the castle's training yard, working through forms with 2 of the castle guard. She waited at the gate. When he saw her, he dismissed the guards and came toward her, and she could tell from his face that he already knew something was coming. "I need to talk to you," she said. "I know." He opened the gate. "I've been expecting it." She walked with him to the stone bench at the edge of the yard, where a flowering tree dropped white petals in the evening wind. "There are things being said," she began. "I know what they're saying." "And?" He turned to look at her. His face was steady. "And I don't care." She held his gaze. "Eden, I need you to actually think about it, not dismiss it. Think about what it means for your reign, for your council's trust, for heaven." His voice was quiet but final. "I have thought about it. I thought about it the night I walked out of the ritual hall to find you. I thought about it every day of this month." He met her eyes. "The people who will doubt my judgment because of who I love are the same people who would find another reason to doubt it if this reason disappeared. I can't govern to satisfy that kind of opinion." She was quiet. "You're not a liability," he said, and his voice was low and direct and very certain. "You're a woman who saw something wrong and said so when it was dangerous to say so. You helped break something that hurt people. If that makes some territorial elder uncomfortable, I think I can survive that." She looked at her hands. "I'm afraid," she said quietly. "Not of you. Not of the bond. I'm afraid of making your life harder. Of being the story they tell when they want to question your decisions." He reached over and took her hands in both of his, and she felt the bond rise in a warm surge that was not overwhelming but was very present. "Let them tell it," he said simply. "I'd rather they tell it and have you here than not tell it at all." She looked up at him. He was looking back at her with that full, steady attention that she had stopped trying to deflect weeks ago. "I love you," she said. It came out quieter than she had intended, but clear. His hands tightened on hers. "I know," he said. And then, "I love you too, for what it's worth from someone who's been pacing his own castle at sunrise for 3 weeks." She laughed, and this time she did not tuck it away. She let it out fully, warm and real, and watched his face do the thing it did when he heard it. That soft, startled opening, like a door he had forgotten how to use. He reached up and tucked a strand of her hair back, his fingers trailing along her jaw as he did. The touch was gentle and deliberate. It sent warmth all the way down her spine. 8 days, he said softly. She looked at him. Her heart was doing something complex and certain. "I know," she said, "but I already know what I'm going to decide." He searched her face. "Tell me." She leaned forward and kissed him, slow and certain, and without the desperation of the library, just full and sure, like a decision already made, like a door finally opened from the inside. When she pulled back, his eyes were dark and very still. "That," she said softly, "was me telling you." The remaining 8 days were the most honest she had ever lived. She stopped managing her feelings toward him. She stopped cataloguing the almost smiles and the quiet moments and filing them away under the heading of things to consider. She simply experienced them, or the warmth of his company, the pleasure of his disagreements, the particular quality of his silences, which she now understood were full, not empty. The way he looked at her in the evenings when they sat together on the stone terrace above the garden and talked about everything and nothing. She moved through the castle, not as a guest anymore, but as someone who lived there, whose presence was woven into its daily rhythms. The staff had started to come to her with small questions, preferences for the garden, thoughts about the library organization, what she thought of the new cook's approach to the evening meal. She answered them honestly and thought about what that meant later. Alone. There was a morning, 6 days from the end, when she found a small carved wolf figurine on her writing desk. Dark stone, perfectly shaped, no larger than her thumb, no note. She picked it up and turned it in her fingers and thought about a man who had packed her bookshelves before she arrived. She set it on the windowsill where the morning light could find it and went downstairs to breakfast. Eden was already there. When she came in, he looked up from his correspondence, and his eyes went to her face with that particular focus she had stopped trying to deflect. She sat down and poured tea and said nothing about the figurine. He said nothing about it either. But she noticed when she glanced up that he was not reading his correspondence anymore. Eden never pushed, he never assumed, but he was present with her fully, the way a person is present when they are not performing or protecting themselves, and she found in that presence something she had not known she was looking for. Safety. Not the safety of walls or power or political alliance, the safety of being known. On the 29th night, they sat together in the garden after dark, the rose scent heavy in the warm air, and the moon above the ridge a day from full, and she reached over and took his hand without saying anything. He turned his palm up the way he always did, and held on. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. She looked up at the moon. She had stood outside a temple and looked up at this same moon and felt abandoned by it. She looked at it now and felt something different. Not gratitude exactly, more like recognition, like the moon had been watching all along and had simply been waiting for her to catch up. She leaned her head against Eden's shoulder. He turned his head slightly, his cheek resting against her hair. They sat like that until the garden went fully dark and the first stars appeared, and the jasmine opened its nighttime scent into the warm air around them. She thought about the drums she had once heard from outside the temple doors. She thought about standing in the cold courtyard with her chin up and nowhere to go. She thought about how extraordinary it was, how completely impossible, that this particular path had led here, to this garden, to this man, to this quiet, certain warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with fate and everything to do with knowing. She breathed slowly. "I don't think I need tomorrow," she said quietly. He was still, the careful stillness of someone paying total attention. "I've known for a while," she continued. "I think I've been waiting to make sure I was choosing it and not just falling into it." She lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him. The moon was almost full above the garden wall, and his face in its light was serious and steady and entirely, completely open. "I'm sure." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a slow kiss to her knuckles, his eyes holding hers above them. "Tomorrow," he said again, softly. "We'll do this properly." She understood. The moon wanted to be full. The ceremony, small as it was, wanted its moment. She nodded. They sat like that until the garden went fully dark. Chapter 7. The Choice Under the Moon. The full moon rose over the moon temple on the 30th night. Heaven dressed herself slowly. While she had brought one dress from the Cantrell territory, the silver one, the one she had worn in the courtyard on the night of the ritual, the one that had caught the moonlight while the ceremony went on without her. She put it on with care and looked at herself in the mirror and thought about the woman who had worn this dress outside the temple doors with her chin lifted and her heart quietly breaking. That woman had not given up. She was grateful for that. Grateful to herself in a way she didn't know how to fully articulate. She met Eden at the castle's main entrance. He was in black, which she expected. He looked at her in the silver dress for a moment without speaking, and she watched the expression move through his eyes. That warmth, that recognition, that careful wonder of a person who still cannot quite believe a thing is real. "De ready?" he asked. She smiled. Yes. They drove to the moon temple as the full moon climbed above the eastern ridge. The temple was quiet tonight. No ceremony, no drums, no assembled pack. Just the ancient stone and the silver lanterns that were always burning and the huge carved doors standing open to the moonlit courtyard, the courtyard where she had stood alone. She walked through it beside Eden. She felt the stones under her feet. She heard the faint sound of crickets in the grass beyond the temple walls. She smelled jasmine on the air and cedar from the lanterns, and underneath all of it, Eden's scent, warm and familiar and entirely, completely right. They stopped in the center of the courtyard. The moon was directly above them, full and silver and absolute. Eden turned to face her. In the moonlight, his face was very clear. Every line of it, the jaw, the steady eyes, the almost mouth that she had catalogued for weeks and loved in every expression it had ever given her. He took her hands. "Heaven Lambert," he said, "I want to ask you something." She held his gaze. "Will you choose me?" She breathed in slowly. She thought about the drums she had heard from outside the temple doors. She thought about Elder Hampton's desk and Morris Chandler's folded arms. She thought about the archive records and the 3 names she had found, and the night she had looked Gerald in the eye and said no. She thought about Myla Hampton's voice in the council chamber, clear and deliberate. She thought about the library and the garden, and 3 weeks of rain and evenings on the terrace, and every conversation that had moved her closer to knowing herself. She thought about love, but not the destined kind, not the compulsory kind, the kind you build in small moments, the kind that grows from actually knowing someone. She looked at Eden. "Yes," she said, "I choose you." His hands tightened on hers. The bond between them moved, not like a snap, not like a crash, but like a river finally allowed to flow through a channel it had been pressing against for weeks. Warm and full and unstoppable, rushing through her in a tide that lit everything from the inside. She felt her wolf go still and singing. She stepped forward into his arms. He held her against him, with the quiet certainty of someone who has been waiting for something for a very long time, and finally does not have to wait anymore. His arms were warm around her. His heartbeat was steady under her ear. The moonlight touched them both. The bonding itself was quiet. No ceremony, no witnesses, no drums or lanterns or assembled crowds. Just the 2 of them in the silver courtyard under the full moon, completing the connection that had been pulling at them since the night he stepped through those doors and found her. The moon was at its highest. The courtyard stones were warm from the day's heat, still holding it the way old stone does, reluctantly, as though knowing the cold is coming and wanting to hold the warmth a little longer. The jasmine was everywhere. The cedar lanterns cast their familiar glow from the temple entrance behind them. Heaven had stood in this courtyard twice now. The first time, she had stood alone. This time, she was not. Eden tilted her face up to his with gentle hands. His eyes held hers for a moment, dark and steady and full of everything the month had built between them. And she thought, not for the first time, that she would never stop being struck by the way he looked at her. Not like something he had won, like something he was still amazed to be allowed to have. When he kissed her this time, it was different from all the others. Not desperate, not held back, complete. The bond between them closed like a door finally locked into place, and she felt it everywhere. In her hands, her chest, her wolf, which had never sounded like anything recognizable but now, in this moment, made a sound that was unmistakably joy. She was laughing slightly when they broke apart, and he was, finally, fully smiling. Not an almost smile. A real one, direct and warm and unreserved. And it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen on his face. "There it is," she said softly. He looked confused for just a moment. "I've been waiting for that smile," she said. He pulled her back in. The news traveled fast. By morning, every territory had received formal notice from the Alpha Council. The Alpha King had completed a mate bond in a private ceremony under the full moon. The name of his mate would be formally introduced at the next territorial summit. Heaven Lambert. The woman who had been banned from the mating ritual. The woman who had refused Gerald Bullock. The woman who had found records that no one else had bothered to look for. There were opinions. There were always opinions. Some territories sent formal congratulations within hours. Some were slower. Some were quite silent. But Heaven read none of them for the first 3 days. She spent those days in the castle garden, in the library, on the terrace above the garden. She walked the northern path at dusk. She drank her tea in the morning sun, while Eden worked at the stone table near the fountain. She fed the dogs who came to sleep in the patches of light that moved across the garden stones throughout the day. She was not performing peace. She was simply in it. On the third morning, Lydia came to find her in the garden and set a cup of tea down beside her, with a look that meant she had something to say. "People are talking about you very differently now than they were a month ago," Lydia said. Heaven looked up. "I thought you should know." Lydia's directness was always clean. The story people are telling, about the woman who stood outside the temple and still found her mate, about the wolf who saw something wrong and said so. It matters to people, especially women in territories like the Cantrell Pack. She paused. "You represent something." Heaven sat with that for a moment. She thought about what she had wanted, a month ago, standing outside those temple doors. She had wanted to be inside. She had wanted what every wolf was told to want, the ceremony, the bond, the traditional path. She had not gotten any of that. Instead, she had gotten something no one had been able to promise her, or arrange for her, or take from her. Something she had found herself, in the courtyard, in the dark, under the moon, while the ceremony continued without her. "Lydia," she said. "Yes? Is there tea for two out here?" Lydia looked at her with that complete, assessing directness. Then she turned and walked toward the kitchen. Eden appeared from the garden path a few minutes later, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, something casual in his bearing that she associated with the hours before his official day began. He sat down across from her. She poured tea into a second cup and slid it across the table. He looked at it, then at her, then back at the garden. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Mila Hampton," she said honestly, "and Nicole, and Stefania. Whether they're going to be all right. The council has assigned advocates to each of them, resources for recovery, whatever they need. He paused. Jeremy Williamson has already requested transfer to be near Nicole's recovery facility. She nodded slowly. Dom, and the Cantrell territory? She asked. New elder appointments in the spring. He met her eyes. I thought you might want some say in that. She looked at him. He looked back with the quiet steadiness that she had come to think of as the truest version of him. Not the Alpha King, not the formal presence in the council chamber, just Eden, the man who had walked out of the most sacred ceremony in the wolf world because he caught a scent and could not, in good conscience, do anything other than follow it. Yes, she said. I would. He nodded. They drank their tea in the morning garden while the light moved through the roses and the dogs arranged themselves across the warm stones, and the fountain played its quiet note. Aro and Heaven Lambert, who had stood outside the temple doors in a silver dress with her chin lifted and her heart quietly breaking, sat in the garden she was beginning to think of as hers, beside the man she had chosen with her whole self, and felt something she recognized, finally, as home. Not the home of a place that keeps you because you have nowhere else to go. Not the home of walls and alliances and pack politics and the careful management of other people's expectations. Home the way you find it in another person, in the particular quality of their quiet, in the way they argue with you, in the almost smiles that eventually become real ones, in the fact that they know who you are and have never once asked you to be smaller. Home is a choice you keep making, every morning, freely. 3 months later, Heaven stood in the Moon Temple again. This time, the silver lanterns were lit for her. This time, the ceremonial fire burned in her honor. This time, the assembled wolves from every territory were there, not because a ritual required them, but because an Alpha King had requested their witness to the formal announcement of his mate. She wore white. Not the silver of exile, not the careful silver of someone proving she had not given up. White, simple, chosen by herself, with Eden's grandmother's rose tucked into her hair. Eden stood beside her at the front of the hall. When the formal announcement was made and the hall responded with the customary acknowledgement, she felt his hand find hers at his side. She squeezed back. She found Winnie's face in the crowd, her cousin, who had traveled from the Cantrell territory to be here. Winnie was crying with her whole face, making no effort to conceal it, which was so deeply characteristic that Heaven almost cried too. She found Mila Hampton's face, further back. Mila was pale and quieter than she once was, and probably always would be. But she was here. She had come. She looked at Heaven with an expression that said everything the two of them had never needed to say out loud. She found Elder Hampton's face, and she found she could look at it with more compassion than anger now. He looked old, diminished. He had not looked at her yet. She did not need him to. She looked forward. She thought about the drums she had once heard from outside these doors. She thought about standing in the courtyard in the dark, her back against a stone pillar, listening to a ceremony proceed without her. Or she thought about what it had taken to still be standing when the doors opened. The stubbornness, the refusal, the quiet, sustained decision to keep her chin up, even when there was nothing visible to be hopeful about. And she thought about what had come from that stubbornness. Not the story of a girl who was always going to end up here, who had been destined from birth for a specific man and a specific moon. The consequence of choosing dignity over submission, of saying what she knew even when it was dangerous to say it, of standing in the courtyard under the moon because she would not hide. Because of those choices, a door had opened. Because of those choices, she was standing here. Heaven, Eden said softly beside her. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her the way he always looked at her, with the full and direct weight of his attention, which she would never entirely get used to and did not want to. "Good?" he asked. She thought about everything the question contained. "Yes," she said. "Very good." He smiled. The real one, the full one, and the moon temple, which had once refused her entry, filled with the warm light of 100 silver lanterns, and the ceremonial drums began to play, and Heaven Lambert stood beside the man she had chosen with her whole self, and the moon above the temple ridge held everything in its wide silver light like it always had, watching, waiting, and finally, at last, satisfied. True love is not forced by fate. It is chosen freely. It is chosen in the moments when choosing costs you something. It is chosen in the archive rooms where records live that no one else has bothered to read. It is chosen in the courtyard, in the cold, with your chin up and nowhere to go. It is chosen in a library at midnight when the argument settles and two people look at each other and decide, without words, not to look away. It is chosen every morning, every single time.